In the previous video, there was a comment that if anyone doesn't agree with me, then it's because they're stubborn and in a cult, or they're deluding themselves. And I took that to be an implication that I simply dismiss critics with those type excuses. While there are plenty of people who genuinely do disagree with me for those reasons, I know that doesn't apply to everyone. So what I have actually said in many of my videos is that the only way to improve your understanding is to seek out the flaws in your current perception and correct them. You can't do that unless you accept the logical probability that you must be wrong about something somewhere, right? At some point, someone is going to know something better than you do, and they can show how or where you're wrong. So whenever anyone criticizes what I have to say, I have to consider the possibility, when there is one, that they might have a point. I need to know that as soon as possible so that I can own it quickly and correct my course if necessary. Better to admit error immediately than to double down and lose credibility. But arguing religion and politics, history, philosophy, and science with hostile interlocutors, as I do and have done almost every day for decades, I've already corrected an awful lot. I know better now than I did early on about a lot of things. You get to a point where you're right most of the time, if you stick with what you know. Arguing politics is tricky because it's largely opinion. Do you care about people or not? Or do you only care about yourself and whatever directly affects you? Do you also care about other people's problems that you don't share, that are not a problem for you? Things that they have to worry about, but that you don't. I think the worst politicians are those who refuse to consider the needs and rights of other demographics until or unless it becomes a personal issue for them as well. That's what being anti-woke is all about. Well, I guess the worst politicians are the ones that don't care what their constituents say at all. They only work for their donors. And that's a big problem here, too. Not everything is merely subjective opinion. There are policies, actions, and behaviors that are objectively good and bad, too. So in an earlier video where I spoke about politics from this balcony, complaining about how so many of the current regime's policies are based on hate, some Trumpster tried to dismiss a whole body of facts and evidence on the excuse that it's all Trump derangement syndrome, a fictitious condition that causes people to say, "Orange man bad," as if there's no long list of very good reasons to say that. Now, this guy became my favorite troll of the moment because he said so many stupid things. For example, he defines a fascist as someone who supports fascism, which is fair. Fascism is defined as a far-right, authoritarian, and ultra-nationalist political ideology defined by a dictatorial leader and forceful suppression of opposition with the regimentation of society and economy, exalting nation and often race above the individual, and which is fundamentally opposed to democracy and liberalism. The troll did not argue against that, and he admits to voting for, defending, and thus supporting all of that. So if he defines a fascist as someone who supports fascism, then by his definition, that makes him a fascist. But he argues that just because a political faction perfectly matches every single characteristic that is diagnostic of fascism doesn't mean that they're fascist, when of course that is exactly what that really does mean. And some Trumpsters say that we can never say anything good about Democrats, that all we do is complain about Trump. And that's not true, because I've made videos praising Democratic policies, like what Biden did and Kamala would have done. I praised Tim Walz for what he did in Minnesota, too. So I wasn't just voting for the lesser evil, I was voting for the greater good. Kamala may not have been my favorite candidate, but she was good enough, where Trump is not. We are not just repeating some mantra that orange man bad. What we are doing is showing a body of objectively verifiable facts and evidence against this marmalade Mussolini, showing how he really is demonstrably bad. And the trolls, who can neither dismiss our evidence nor produce any in his favor, and who are so devoted to him anyway that they will lie for him, all they can do is cite Trump derangement syndrome, thus showing how he is indefensibly bad. I think we can prove this objectively. So I asked the troll what metric he would accept to determine whether someone is a bad person and or a bad president. Meaning that when we weigh the positives and negatives, then on balance that person or president is verifiably overwhelmingly bad. For example, looking back over the course of my lifetime, JFK was president for about a month before I was born. In my opinion, he was a great president and overall a good person, even though he cheated on his wife, breaking his promise to her, and that's relevant when we're evaluating whether someone is trustworthy. Richard Nixon was a bad person, but not necessarily a bad president. He actually did some good things in his term. He did some really bad things too, and I'm not just talking about Watergate. But weighing all of that, I think almost balances out. In my opinion, Jimmy Carter was a great person, but not necessarily a great president, being the only Democratic president who didn't improve the economy over that of his Republican predecessors and successors. Reagan was an okay person, but a bad president. He started the cascading failure of trickle-down economics that every Democrat rejects, building our economy back up until the next Republican tears it down again. George H.W. Bush was meh, both as a president and as a person. George W. Bush was an okay person, but a bad president. Clinton was a bad person. I'm embarrassed that I supported him at first because I hated him toward the end for several things that he did. But he was actually a pretty good president otherwise, conversely. Obama is a great person and pretty good as a president, too, weighing the good with the bad. Promises kept versus promises broken, because there were some things that pissed me off. Achievements contrasted with unjustified actions, because there certainly were some of those. Obama comes in at about 60-40 to the positive, I think. Again, based on what I know. He ran on the slogan of change we can believe in. But after 8 years of him, I don't believe much has changed. The economy had improved, of course, as it had under every Democratic president since Clinton. And there were also human rights advances and improvements in health care options and other things like that that tipped the scale in Obama's favor. Biden is just an okay person, but he actually did a lot better as president than I thought he would. I expected him to disappoint me more and sooner than he did. Actually pleasantly surprised with how he performed. Trump, however, is the worst president of my lifetime so far. And he's the worst person ever to be president in my lifetime, maybe ever. Weighing the positives and negatives, we have a fuck ton of incredibly awful negatives, worse than any American president to date, and not one positive, neither as a president nor as a person. Trump is just bad, all bad, incredibly bad, with nothing redeemable about him. Even with Hitler, we could say that he was a vegetarian artist who loved dogs and children, except Jewish children, of course. But what could anyone honestly say is nice about Trump? There's nothing good about him, nothing whatsoever, neither as a person nor as a president. The troll misunderstood that, of course, thinking that I was saying that Hitler was better than Trump. No. Weighing positives and negatives, Hitler at least had something positive we could say, though his negatives outweigh everyone everywhere ever. Now, Trump is not as bad as Hitler. But both as a person and as an American president, Trump is certainly overwhelmingly bad. And I think we can prove that objectively. So I asked my troll, how should we do that to his satisfaction? So that he would stop pretending as if Trump derangement syndrome is a thing. Because we both know that's a lie, and I would like to stop hearing it. He refused, accusing me of being emotional. But while I admit that I am passionate about this because the stakes are so fucking high, and because I love my country despite what Trump says about me and my demographic, that we all hate America. No. We love America and Trump does not. We love the Constitution and Trump does not. We're patriotic and Trump is not. But despite my passion, I'm still asking for objective data. What we can prove to be true or false, and that would or should count toward or against a person or a president being good or bad. Data is not emotion. Facts do not depend on emotion. I would ask you the same thing I asked of this troll. What are the facts of the matter? Let's weigh them out on either side of the scale and see which way it tilts. I think it's easy enough to come up with objective metrics that count toward whether someone is good or bad. Is the economy better or worse? Our economy is definitely much worse by every metric, where it was the best in the world until the time that Trump took over. It really was. COVID negatively impacted every country around the world, but we had the best economic recovery of any nation. Things were definitely looking up before and until Trump tore it all down. Evaluating a president as good or bad, did they create jobs or did they lose jobs? In Trump's first term, he had lost more jobs than anyone since Herbert Hoover, largely because of how he mismanaged the pandemic. Remember that Trump closed down the pandemic response team like a month before the pandemic hit, of course. And now in Trump's second term, it's plagued by the worst jobs report in recent history, with tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs lost and hundreds of thousands of government layoffs. All of that is objectively bad. What other metrics might we consider? How about this? If someone has multiple times been adjudicated for fraud, then are they more or less trustworthy than someone who has never been accused of, much less charged with fraud? Is it good or bad for a president to have lied over 30,000 times just in his first term and who has only continued that streak ever since, telling more lies in any given week than some folks do in their whole lives, with several of those lies resulting in the deaths of many innocent people? And Trump says he's religious, which he obviously isn't, and that he loves the Bible, which he's clearly never read. More lies. The Bible is explicitly against lust and greed, gluttony, wrath, etc. But Trump is the personification of the 7 deadly sins made flesh. And Jesus said that a divorcee can never remarry because that would be adultery. So someone who cheated on all 3 of his wives while they were still alive and married to him, would he be more or less Christian than someone who only married once and never cheated? Since the 1970s, 28 women have accused Donald Trump of sexual misconduct, including unwanted advances that he first bragged about on a hot mic, but then later denied ever doing once it, after it got him into trouble, of course. But he's a liar again, but we already know that. Remember, being accused of making unwanted sexual advances does not mean that you're guilty, not even when dozens of women and girls say so. But bragging about doing it is an admission of guilt. Does that count toward being a good or bad person? Or let me ask that another way. Would it count toward being a bad person if Obama had done it? Or Biden? Or is it only okay when Trump does it? Trump was also found liable by a jury in court for sexual assault. When weighing positives and negatives, would being an adjudicated rapist count toward being a good or bad person? Would that be the case for anyone and everyone else except just not for Trump? He's a shitty businessman who squandered his father's fortune and only kept afloat by allegedly laundering money through the New York mobsters and then allegedly through the Russian mafia. That's how to bankrupt a casino. And Trump actually would have been better off financially if he had invested his inheritance and done nothing with it except spend it the way a normal rich person would. At least he wouldn't have bankrupted himself a half a dozen times. So, would his many frauds count toward being a good or bad businessman? Especially when there are no successes to weigh against his many failures. The troll replied to all of these by saying that a convicted felon can be more trustworthy than an honest person, that lying all the time is no worse than only lying a few times in a whole life, that cheating on your marriage is irrelevant when considering morality, even though society would normally objectively view a chronic history of immoral behavior as a negative sign, not a positive one. And the troll said that a conviction in court doesn't have any more gravity than an unsupported accusation. But being found guilty or liable by a jury is an objectively established legal fact, and will remain so until or unless that conviction is somehow overturned. After answering all of these questions with these lies, the troll then called me a liar, even though I never lied to him nor to anyone at any point in my career. Now, how would you have answered each of those questions? We have a long and growing list of unconstitutional actions that Trump is pushing, all of them damaging to the American economy, global ecology, human rights, and everything else, all of which count toward him being a bad president. Essays could be written listing different reasons why he is a bad president. And how many different reasons do you know? And remember, we're only talking about objectively verifiable facts, not opinions. Can you respond with some on his behalf? Can you list even one thing Trump ever enacted that was good for anyone other than himself? Because even Nixon did good things in office, things that he gained nothing by doing, that only benefited other people. Not rich donors either, but just regular people who could never pay him back. But Trump has never done a good thing in his life. He's never done anything for anyone that didn't also benefit himself first and foremost. This is why Trump reportedly said at a military cemetery that all those soldiers who died for their country were suckers and losers. Because what's in it for them? Because Trump cannot conceive of altruism, making a sacrifice for someone else because they need something, not because you want something more than you already have. I defy you to cite any exception to that, any altruistic gesture that Trump ever did for anyone else that didn't also benefit himself. I've challenged several Trump supporters to cite anything that is objectively good about Trump. An answer that I did get was that despite how Trump had publicly denigrated Ruth Bader Ginsburg as a Supreme Court justice, he did still say something nice, like he was told to do in her eulogy. Then he disrespected her dying wish not to be replaced until the end of the election, which would have held Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham to their promises too. They promised not to seat a justice so late in the election, but Republicans don't keep their promises anymore. Seems they're all just liars now. So Trump replaced her immediately with a religious extremist just over a week later, 40 days before the election day. So let's take all the bad points I listed and weigh them against that one time when Trump said that the recently deceased RBG was amazing. Does Trump come out to be a good or bad person, weighing all that together? If we take everything into consideration, then is he a good president or a really impressively bad one? There was one other thing the troll said in Trump's defense, one policy that would be objectively good. That Trump had recently lowered drug prices in the U.S. If true, then I would have to agree that one would be a good point in his favor, weighed against a whole lot of bad. But it's not the whole story, is it? Trump said that the way he would lower drug prices here would be to raise those prices in Europe. So you're unnecessarily gouging prices for people who need the medication. And then Trump said he would go on to extort Europeans into paying those higher prices by taxing their imports, such that Americans have to pay higher prices for cars to offset the reduced cost of our drugs. Helping you by hurting them and hurting them until they have to hurt you is not helping you. Likewise, Trump's big ugly bill will hurt you because it only helps billionaires in how they hurt you too. Kamala would have done good things for you, just like Biden did too. But what has Trump ever done that was good for you?